It is Jaime Jo Wright here with Mad Lit Musings, and I am excited today because I think we're going to have a really good talk. I have with me author Moriah Chavis, and she's an author of YA fantasy, and we're going to talk about her book, and we're going to talk about all kinds of things. But first, welcome to Mad Lit Musings.
Oh, thanks for having me. I'm so excited. I love your books, and so I was so excited when you read mine and you really enjoyed it.
Oh,
I was like,
yeah,
I was
I did.
honored.
Well, it's fun, Well, first of all, you have a stunning cover, so
Oh,
I'm
thank
I'm
you.
one of those visual people. Like if I see a cover that is amazing, I'm like, I don't care what the book's about. I'm just going to buy it for the cover.
I know I'm a
But
I'm a cover. Covers trap me. They entrap me so
yeah,
bad.
they do. They do. They do. It's kind of like it awakens the imaginary senses, I
Hmm.
think, when you have a really good cover.
Yes, and I love covers with faces on them. Like I know some people don't love them because they like to be able to picture the people themselves, but
Right.
like especially like in fantasy, I love when a cover has a face on it because I just think it draws me in because I'm like
Hmm.
I want to know what that person's life is about. Like
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
I love this. I love good covers.
Yeah. I can take it or leave it. Like with my books, I love the atmospheric elements. I'm usually not too big with people, but if my publisher sent me one with a person on it, I don't think I'd be upset either. Like
Hmm.
I can kind of take it either way. So
Yeah. I can spot a Charlie Bowater cover from a mile away. Like I was in the bookstore with somebody because
yes.
I love faces on covers, and so
Mhm.
I can spot her covers. And I was with her, and I was like, "That's Charlie Bowater," and she's like, "Are you sure?" I'm like, "Yeah, look at the back." And then she was like, "Can you do this with all her books?" I was like, "Yes, her art style is so specific." And it's like if I ever had a cover with that Charlie Bowater design, I feel like I would have made it. Like she
Yeah.
designed my cover, so I'm done. Like I don't need to publish anything else.
You know that you've really entered the book world deeply when you not only know the authors, but you know the book cover designers
I know.
by name.
I know. I'm in deep. So
That's like, oh, okay, we have really delved deep into books.
yes.
But it makes sense because you hold a bachelor's in liberal arts, but you also have a master's in library and
Mhm.
information science. So books are kind of your world.
Yes, I deal with books at my day job, at my job at home. I deal with them all the time.
That's so fun. So fun. So how long have you been doing that with the
I just
library?
finished my fourth
Okay.
year in
Okay.
teaching, so I'm gonna
Awesome.
start my fifth year in August.
Cool. Awesome. That's great. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about your book, and then I want to talk YA fantasy and the whole world of fantasy novels. But you have a book that I did read and I did order based off of the cover. And plus you have a fun Instagram channel. So there's
Oh,
you've got that
thanks.
going for you too. But it's called Heart of the Sea. And I think the other thing that snagged me, is that a word? I don't know. We're going to call that a word. The other thing that snagged me was the fact that there was pirates involved. I am a sucker for pirates.
Yeah, they're fun, like to explore pirates. I love Pirates of the Caribbean, and that's kind of
Yeah.
where that idea kind of came from, because they are. I think the thing about Pirates of the Caribbean specifically is it really delves deep into like, the characters and seeing them as good people, even though they do this thing that's technically illegal. And so
Right.
I think that's really fun because you're rooting for the characters, but then you're also like, well, they probably should be arrested for that. But you know, it's fun. I can't remember the word for it, but it's like they're 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 in this gray area
Yeah.
morally, but also they're not so like gray or so dark that
hmm
it's we can't be on their side like if we were
Yeah.
necessarily in that world. So
Yeah. That's a fair assessment because I would say a pirate is sort of a lovable hero. Or, and
mhm.
I'm sorry, not a lovable hero, a lovable villain. Let me get that right. Who can also play the hero role.
Yes.
But if you were to write like a novel with a lovable serial killer,
Oh my gosh.
that would just be really difficult. I think maybe the only success I've ever seen with that concept was probably the show Dexter,
Mhm.
where the serial killer was serial killing serial killers. But we won't go into that too much. But that was probably the only time I've seen that successfully done. But so tell us a little bit about Heart of the Sea now that I've completely gone off topic with serial killers.
It's okay. So, I mean, seeing what you write, I'm not surprised.
Right, I
So,
know. It's
yeah,
inevitable. Sorry.
yeah, it's fine. So Heart of the Sea is about my main character, Narissa. Her sister has gone missing, and so in order to save her, she has to steal the fastest ship to get there, to get to the land that she's being held at. But the guy who's captaining it has been ordered to kill her by an evil queen, and so it's there. Will he kill her? Will he follow through with this plan? Will she actually make it to where she's supposed to be going? And so, why will they? Won't they? And
Hmm.
how are they going to get along when obviously there's this tension already at the very beginning?
That's awesome. And there's some romance in this. Although
Yes.
I will say I was pleasantly surprised because it's romance that I wouldn't mind my 14-year-old daughter reading.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, I want, like, I think when I started reading YA when I was 12, and so
Okay.
I know that technically they might at the the beginning of YA they might not have been like, oh, these are going to be 12-year-old readers, but I think especially with kids who are more precocious when it comes to reading, they are going to already be wanting something that is a longer book, a book that has more, more characters in it, more complicated
Hmm.
themes, especially girls. I mean, that may sound like I'm putting girls in that whole category, but I was already interested in romance at age
Right.
12. I don't know if my husband was.
No.
Like
I have
he
a
was,
12-year-old
yeah.
boy right now, and romance is the farthest thing from his mind.
Yeah.
Right.
My husband was reading Lord of the Rings in fourth grade, whereas I was trying to find books that, were about first crushes and, all kinds of stuff like that. And so and even now, it's so funny, because even now, my husband's 28, and even now, we went and saw the extended edition of Lord of the Rings, The Two Towers,
Hmm.
on Sunday, because
Hmm.
they had it in theaters. And even now, he's like, Arwen's not even in the book this much. Like, I don't even know why they put her in the movie this much. And I'm like, oh my gosh, like,
They put her in the movie
they
for women that need some
I know.
romance.
He's
Please.
like, she's barely even in the book. I don't even. I'm like, oh my goodness. And so I just think it's so funny. And so yeah, but I wanted to write romance where like my mom, because my parents they never really told me I couldn't read anything, which I think was really
Hmm.
smart, because if you tell a kid they can't read anything, then obviously they're
Right.
gonna read it immediately.
Right.
But what my mom would do is she would read the things with me, or she would let me go to the bookstore and pick out the books that I wanted. Um, I mean, obviously, if it's like a book in the adult section, we're probably not going to go there. But like, she read The
Hmm.
Hunger Games before I did, and she loved it. So then she hands it to me,
Hmm.
and so not only did it create like a conversation between me and her as parent to child, but it also kind of showed that she trusted me with things that were, had more complicated themes, and also opened up possibility for conversation. And
Right.
so I wanted to give books that were appropriate for the age that I was intending, because I want like 12-year-olds to be able to read my book because I was reading
Hmm.
YA, and then I also want 18-year-olds to be reading it. So it is like a complicated thing because there's a really big gap between 12 to 18. But I
Right.
also think that some people, they want this romance that is more like, it doesn't go too far. And I think
Hmm.
that's really important, because not every book has to have open door scenes or even closed door scenes,
Right.
because every relationship is different. And so I wanted to write a relationship that showed that.
Right. And I think that's so cool because you've got, yes, you have 12-year-olds who are reading it, although your book I wouldn't say is meant as, it wouldn't classify as middle grade fiction.
Hmm.
Um because your hero and your heroine are in their upper teens. But I remember as a 12-year-old, I didn't want to read about 12-year-olds. I wanted to read about
No.
what was just beyond, but it was still reachable. Like it didn't seem like ages away before I'd get to that age, and people who are 17 and 18 just seem so
They seem so
mature.
old.
Oh my goodness. I thought they were like the cat's meow. And now I'm like, wow, you guys are just babies. Um,
Like the book that got me into reading was Twilight when I was in
okay.
sixth grade. My mom handed me Twilight, and she's like, I think you'll
Mhm.
just like this, because I was a good reader. But one of the things that I talk about this at my job because it's public school. I'm like,
Yeah.
I think one of the problems that we have is that we force reading on children,
Hmm.
and then we don't talk about how reading is supposed to be something that's fun. It's not supposed to be
Right.
something that you do in order to be smarter. It's just something you're supposed to do that you enjoy. And so with that, like, I don't know if you know what AR is,
Hmm.
accelerated reader, but that was huge when I was like in elementary school. And I hated it because I'm just like, you want me to read these books and then a test determines whether or not like I did it right. And
Right.
which for some people they're like, well, it works well for kids who are competitive. I'm like, yeah, but it didn't work for me because I'm like, if I have to read a book and do it a certain way, then I don't really want to like do it.
Right.
I want to do it the way I want to do it. Because that's how reading it should be. You should be able to
Mhm.
read things, and then like I said, they've made us take these tests that would do our reading level. And then so like I know one of the kids in my class who was one of like the kids that was a really good reader, like his reading level was so high, like the only book he could read in our library was Jurassic Park, and he's like in sixth
Oh,
grade. And I'm like,
oh
Jurassic
no.
Park is a really like it's a good book, but also it's like sixth grade. Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm not sure that's really interesting. So, I was reading Twilight, and so I was
Hmm.
interested in characters that were 16 and 17 because
Yeah.
Bella's 17 at the beginning of it.
Right.
Um, and so, like I said, like you said, you're reading books
Mhm.
that are not necessarily your age. I don't even really remember reading much middle grade because I kind of went from like Narnia and stuff, and The
Right.
Giver, and then I automatically went to like Twilight.
Yeah.
So,
You almost jump that section
yeah,
of middle grade. Not saying that there shouldn't be middle grade fiction, because I do think that's really
yeah,
important. But there are a lot of kids that jump that. So we're entering the world of YA fantasy, which is usually, I think, if I'm correct in saying, that genre is probably starting around 16 years old and up, typically, if people were to categorize it. But I have a bone to pick with the whole YA fantasy genre, because there are so many YA fantasy books coming out that I'm seeing now that I don't like. What?
yeah.
Like, there's good fantasy, like they're good stories, and there's super thick novels that, like, people are, going the way of Harry Potter with their really thick fantasy novels. But there's a lot of adult material in the
Hmm.
books. And so I think there's kind of a misnomer now with the concept young adult, and then adults are picking up young adult. And if they read something that's too young, they're like, well, this was written for kids. I'm like, well, young adult, it's young. So what's your
Hmm.
thoughts on that? There, I'm opening up my topic here.
I think people who have read young adult for years, especially before it became so popular.
Hmm.
I think before the internet, when it was kind of just, it was here. And,
Yeah.
Twilight made it big. And because the movie came out in 2008. So I'm talking like around this time when people learned what young adult was, it was always synonymous with teen.
Hmm.
And so people who either started reading young adult like in the early 2000s, 2010s, or before, like to us, like we all know, like teen and YA is synonymous. Like it goes together. It's the same
Right.
thing.
Right.
But then people who are just now starting to read YA or just now getting into it, they don't understand. And I think part of it is there is a problem with how we're labeling things. And I actually was working at a bookstore when they changed the label from teen to young adult. And I was like, well, this is great. To me, as think somebody who understands that young adult and teen are the same thing, I'm like,
Right.
that's fine. Everybody calls it young adult anyway. But then I'm looking at this years later and I'm like, oh, this is just making people really confused. Because
Hmm.
if I go to the Barnes and Noble in my town, it's young adult. But if I go to Second and Charles, which is just another chain bookstore, it's
Hmm.
teen. The exact same books on the shelves. And
Yeah.
so I'm like, I know that. And some people know that, but not everybody knows that. And so I
Right.
think there is confusion with labeling. I don't know if it was done on purpose or on accident. Either way, the confusion is now here. And
Right.
so,
Right.
but like people get so heated over it. And I'm just
Hmm.
like, it's always been this way in publishing. Like if you are looking for an agent, or writers who are looking for agents, they'll say their children's list includes YA, and I'm like,
Hmm.
children and YA, they go together. Like middle grade
Right.
YA, they're right next to each other. Because if we say young adult is for like young adults technically, then where are our teen books? Because then it goes from middle grade, which obviously goes with
Right.
middle school. So what happened to like there's no high school, like there's no high school if we don't
Right.
have young
Right.
adult as the high school like level, or even like early college. Because if you think about it, I mean, kids going to college are
Hmm.
still only 18.
Oh,
Like,
right.
so, I mean, like I know that technically the world considers you an adult at 18, but if my parents had thrown me out and they're like, okay, you're on your own, I would have been up the
I would have
creek.
been in
And
so much trouble.
I know, and I know not everybody is as lucky as I am to have not been just like, thrown to yourselves at
Hmm.
18. But I know that some kids they're still really struggling at 18. At 18, I had no idea what I wanted to do with my life.
Hmm.
Um, so, I mean, I think that it's very important to have like this genre where people can see that even at 18, these characters have no idea what they want to do with their lives. Like they might be, doing something amazing, conquering something fantastical, but still at the root of it, they're still trying to find themselves. And that is
Hmm.
a teenage experience. That's not
Right.
necessarily a young adult experience per se.
Right, right. How do you address the difference between what you write and then some of the YA fantasy that is getting into the more sexualized elements of teenage sexuality or open, like you were mentioning earlier, like even some open door sexuality that's, you're reading and all of a sudden you're like, whoa, okay, we're going to go there. And this is YA fantasy. And you're like,
Yeah.
what? So how do you differentiate from that? What's your thought process on that?
Oh, I mean, I know I've read some adult books that are not as blatant about what's going on as young adult books, and that to me
Right.
is a problem. Like, there's this crime fiction series that I read, and the characters are in their 30s and 40s, so obviously they're going to be have sexual relationships. Not of one time that I, and it's seven books so far, not one time has any time that any of the characters have sex been explained to me. It's
Hmm.
literally just they had sex and then it goes to the next thing. And I'm like, so I understand if you want to include it because it, for some people, I mean, I understand because there's the argument that, well, teenagers are having sex anyway, but I'm like, but they don't need it explained on the page. Like that is,
Hmm.
it's
Hmm.
fiction. And they're like, well, fiction teaches us about reality to an extent, but
Right.
also like fiction is also still fiction. It's not reality. And so
Right.
I think sometimes it's giving children and teens unrealistic expectations of what they're going to expect in relationships with their future partners, and then it just gives them an unrealistic idea of what they're going to expect when they are adults, and that's not good. And so I mean, I'm not trying to like censor anything, but also our brains are so powerful. They can do so many
Hmm.
things. And you have to be so careful about what you put in your mind because your mind is limitless. It can create all kinds of things. And so if we're not careful, it's important that we open up conversations, but it's not important but it's not necessarily that we need to have the entire conversation on the page. Like
Hmm.
like I was saying with, my mom, she would not she wouldn't necessarily say, oh, you can't read that. She would read it with me if she was
Hmm.
necessarily worried about the book. Or she would read it first and then be like, this was so good. And that opens up a conversation just as much as anything else. But I feel like when they're putting too much on the page in YA, then it's also making it seem like it's still something that they have to hide.
Hmm.
And it shouldn't be something that they have to hide. It should be something that you're having an open conversation about, which
Right.
there's a lot of problems with this. And it's not just in publishing. You could go into how the church has a
Mm.
problem with how
Yeah.
they haven't talked about, sex enough, or how it's seen as something that we shouldn't
Hmm.
talk about. Um, and so that's a whole other thing. Like it's a very multi-step
Right.
conversation,
Right.
and it's gonna have to have a lot of people talk about it. People be more open about it. But I read before I got married, I read this one book called Party of One, and it was about singleness in the church. It doesn't necessarily, but it did talk about like, you know, because you're still single and God created, he created sex. So then
Hmm.
it was talking about those kind of things and how you need to look at that as a single person, how you need to look at that when you're no longer single and you're in a
Hmm.
relationship. And I think more books like that need to be like talked about. Like more books
Sure.
need to have open conversations that are just giving you the information, but not necessarily making it sexualized. I hope that makes sense. Like,
No, that totally makes sense. I don't.
yeah,
Yeah, and I would agree. I don't think that as parents of teenage, I'm a parent of teenagers. I don't want to shy away from the conversation and go back to the Regency era where
yeah,
young women are getting married and then are getting completely shocked after they're
yes,
married, going, "What just happened?" So I don't want to go back to those days. And I think the conversation is really important. But I think getting back to what you were saying, there is a glamorization
hmm,
of a sexual relationship or a romantic relationship that can take place on the page, which paints a completely erroneous picture for young minds that are just learning what some of these topics are, exploring it, etc., in their own personal life, and so. And then there's the other aspect too, where we have YA, and you do have a 12-year-old picking up
hmm.
the YA novel, and is that appropriate for a 12-year-old to be reading?
Yeah. Well, then also there's you could even tie in the conversation of like mental health with it because teenagers especially are changing so much
Yeah.
from the ages of 13 to 18. Your
Hmm.
hormones are changing, everything about you is changing, your body is changing. Like all these things are happening to you and you're like, what the heck is going on? And I think when you have like open door scenes in books that
Hmm.
are glamorized, it does paint that picture of things that aren't necessarily actually happening. But then it gives you this false sense when you're so young and you're so impressionable, and it kind of shifts how you think about it from such an early age. And like I said, I don't believe that sex is something that should not be talked about. Like I think it's
Right.
something that should be discussed
Hmm.
more, and that's
Hmm.
why we have this problem because it's still seen as something that we should hide from our parents or we should hide from adults, and that's just not the case. Like it's something that should be talked about. And
Hmm.
so because you are changing so much, I don't think that we definitely talk about how relationships from various like levels affect you mentally, and that's not put into account enough about how, you know, having all these people in your lives at different levels, like the kind of relationships you have. Good relationships are going to affect you in a positive light, and these toxic relationships are going to affect you too. And we talk about after it happens, everybody talks about the trauma of it, but we should
Hmm.
be talking about it before it happens, like or like
Hmm.
when it's happening and why it's important for you to pick somebody who's good for you and why it's important to see these relationships where not all of this is expected of you, like where we have boundaries and you're allowed to say no and it's not seen as something that
Right.
is like seen as, I don't know, maybe like a conservative thing. Like you're allowed to say no if you're not comfortable in any situation. And
Hmm.
so that's something that should be talked about more too.
Right, right, right. So what's your thoughts then when you look at fiction and you look at fiction as it's written for teenagers? What do you think are important elements that should be included in YA fiction that you feel really sets the genre apart and makes it super valuable for that age group to be able to pick up a fantasy novel and read it?
I love including, which sounds kind of strange, but I think that it's so important to include all these like darker, more complicated things happening in books because that's inevitable. That's part of life, and it is going to happen
Hmm.
to people at various stages. Everybody's life is different. Some people are not going to have traumatic things happen to them until they're an adult, but some kids are going to. But I think at the end of the day that we need to show that even if all these things affect you, even if you have to undergo trauma when you're a kid or you go through something that definitely impacts you, that there's hope at the end and that there's
Hmm.
light, that you can overcome it. So seeing that, dragons can be defeated, I think it's a Neil Gaiman quote about how you don't need to tell children that dragons are real. They already know they're real. It's just you need to show them that they can be defeated. And I
Yeah.
think that's obviously butchering the quote, but I think
But
it's
it's
kind
it's
of
the
along
general
those
drift of
lines.
it though.
Yeah.
I know which one you're talking about. Yep.
Yeah, yeah. And so like that's the thing. You need to show them that dragons can be defeated
Hmm.
no matter what form that dragon takes. At the end of the day, that you can overcome it. But it's gonna take people in your life. I think that's why the found family trope is so popular in so many
Hmm.
books because it shows you a support system
Yeah.
that's not necessarily related to you. Um, I'm querying something right now, and I was thinking, and of course it came to me after someone had asked me this question, and they were like, "How is your book different?" And I was like, what I should have said was, it does have a happily ever after, but it's not necessarily for the couple; it's for the family, and I
Mm.
think that's important too, is to
Hmm.
show that you can have complicated relationships with family members because I don't think anybody doesn't have a complicated relationship, but you can overcome that. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're not going to come out with, scars and bruises and everything from it,
Hmm.
metaphorically speaking. But, there is a way to overcome these things. Forgiveness is very important in stories and showing that kids, that you can forgive somebody. Um, because I think so many times there's this darkness over books right now, and I feel like
Hmm.
where people want books that show darker themes, but they don't end happy. There's the love of the villain, which I understand to an extent, but then I'm also like, but it's the villain.
Right.
Like we shouldn't be romanticizing the villain in every single story.
Right.
Um, so yeah, like
No, I.
like nobody loves Voldemort, like, you know, and
No,
so
no, I don't. Yeah, it never dawned on me to put a poster of Voldemort up on my wall.
no, it
You know,
didn't. And
no.
so, but I didn't. There's been a definite shift since Harry Potter to now, where
Hmm.
the
There
villain is the
has.
villain.
Yeah, that's a really good point too. Like that line is becoming more blurred between good and evil
Hmm.
sometimes, um, and it's especially noticeable, I think, in the fantasy and the speculative genres because there's more of a declaration of good versus evil in so many of those stories. So,
I know I saw somebody talking about Game of Thrones on Instagram this morning, actually,
mhm,
and she was talking about one of the characters, and people were like, but he was not that terrible. And then she went through this whole thing of like, okay, he might not have been terrible in this scene, but
mhm,
everywhere else, it showed that he could have avoided this, but he chose not to in every other
right,
scene.
right.
I tried reading Game of Thrones, and I honestly couldn't read it. I read the first one, but I couldn't read anymore because the characters are so unlikable. And
Well,
like
you know that they're all villains for the most part. I mean, if
they
you've
are
watched the
terrible.
show, it's brutal.
My husband likes Game of Thrones, and I'm just like, okay, I like John.
Yeah,
That's it.
yeah.
Like,
Honestly,
and
though, I think that might be one of the reasons he's more popular. I mean,
yeah,
he is such a popular character. I mean, outside of the fact that Jon Snow looks good on camera,
yeah.
you know, but
But
he's got that character.
even when I was, because I did listen to the audiobook of the first one, but even when I was
Okay.
listening to the audiobook, I would be like, yes, it's a John chapter because all these other characters are terrible. Like, I don't care what they're thinking. Like, Cersei, oh my gosh. I
Oh,
might as well have just skipped her chapters because I would fast forward so much. And I'm just like, yeah. And so I'm like, if you think about it that way, like these characters that people are falling in love with, they're just
hmm,
making them romanticized on the page, but they're kind of like the characters in Game of Thrones. They're still
they are.
terrible. It's
They are.
just their terribleness is kind of glamorized. And
Well,
so
it is
I'm just
interesting. If you take some of the themes, I mean, if we use Game of Thrones as an example, and you take some of the themes of the characters' lives, and you don't identify this was supposed to be a hero or a heroine, and this was supposed to be a villain or a villainess, then if you just write down like the things that they experience or the things that they inflict on others, so many of them would come across like you wouldn't know who you would just say, well, that's a villain. Okay, that's a villain. You know,
hmm
there's incest, there's rape, there's murder, there's betrayal, there's deceit, dishonor, all kinds of crazy things. And you're like, what? And that's the hero. You're
I
like,
know,
what
I
happened?
know. Like my husband is rewatching House of the Dragon because
Uh,
it's the new season's coming out
right,
soon.
right.
And like I don't watch it from the beginning to end. I'll just be like in the kitchen or doing something and it's on the
Hmm.
TV because our kitchen and living room is the same like in the same
Sure.
area. And I'll just be like, I kind of get why she's terrible. Like,
Yeah,
and then I'm also like, but I kind of get why she's mad at her. And then I'm like,
right.
but okay, so there's the relationship between Rhaenyra and her stepmother, whose name I
Hmm.
cannot remember right now. And I actually told him at one point, I was like, I want to see that story. Like, I don't care about anything else, but I want to see what happens when your best friend marries your dad. And you're
Right.
like, of course you would be mad about that. Like,
Yeah,
of course that's gonna traumatize you.
yeah.
And I'm just like, that's an interesting story. Like, why
Uh-huh.
aren't we talking about this more? And I don't know. It's just, yeah, Game of Thrones. I just can't get behind it. I mean, they're well written, I assume, but it was well written. I have to give it that. But I only
Yes.
like John, so. But yeah.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's it. I mean, and there's going to be books for everybody, but I think kind of what you and I are getting at in this conversation anyway, if we were to summarize it, is we need to have fiction available in the YA fantasy genre that has some very clear lines between good and evil, has some very clear lines between hero versus villain, and then has lines that we're not necessarily going to cross before it's time for that reader to actually cross them. So, that being said, if anyone, whether you're an adult who's 57 years old, or you're 18 years old, or you're 10, and we pick up one of your books, what should we expect from your books?
So in Hard to See specifically, there is kissing, but it doesn't go above the kissing. I think it would probably be described as PG-13. I have had some
Mm-hmm.
like 12-year-olds read it. But like I said, that was like Twilight was PG-13. I was reading that too.
Right. Mm-hmm.
But I always have a thread of hope. I always like to say that our choices are defined as more than the things that happen to us.
Mm-hmm.
So how we choose to handle situations matters more than the situations that happen to us.
Yeah.
Um, and I think in teenage years especially, it's so hard to make a decision that's not emotionally driven. And
Mm,
so, but if you're
yeah.
able to just sit back and think, so that's kind of what I want to do is look at books as a whole picture, the story as a whole picture. Like she could have done this, she could have done that. I love when there are certain books out there, not necessarily my books, but I love when there's certain books that have characters like the villain and the hero.
Hmm.
Like it's like it is like Harry Potter. Harry Potter, the exact same thing happens to the villain as does the hero.
Right.
Harry and Voldemort are both orphans. They are both thrown into situations where they're either Voldemort's in the orphanage where he's not cared for, and Harry's in this awful family situation. They both go to Hogwarts. One ends up splitting his soul in half, and the other one ends up saving the wizarding world. And so it's
Right.
just like the situation that happens to you is not what defines you; it's how you handle it. And
Mm,
so I always like to, give that thread of hope that you can overcome the bad
hmm.
things that have happened to you.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. I love that so much. And so well worth reading too, Heart of the Sea,
Oh,
for
thank you.
anybody who's listening. Mariah and I are having fun having these conversations just because it's fun to chat kind of some of the stuff that's out there in the world and see what people's opinions are and everything like that. But we have the Heart of the Sea, which is available right now. And then is there anything else that you're working on or that we can be looking forward to?
I have a supernatural mystery that comes out next year.
Ooh.
So I'm really excited about it. It's fun. I finished my first, well, it was originally going to be something different, but then
Hmm.
I gave it to the publisher that's doing it. It's with 20 Hills Press. And they
Okay.
were like, we like this, but can you do this instead? So I had to rewrite it. And I am now self-editing it, about to start self-editing it after I sent them. I sent it to my, one of the editors and she's like, this is already so much better. I'm like, well, that's
Oh,
great.
that's awesome.
And so that's coming out sometime in 2025, probably in the fall. And
Okay.
so I'm excited about that one.
Awesome. Does it have a title yet, or are we still waiting?
It had a title, but when we changed it, I think it's changing, so I'm not 100% sure what the title
I know,
is.
isn't that funny? Like people ask me what's the title, I'm like, well, I can give you the working title, but I'm
Yeah.
not sure what's going to end up on the front of the book.
It was originally it was a short story that I had written called Ghost at Midnight about a
Ooh.
girl who she survives tuberculosis. And she's actually she just survives
Hmm.
tuberculosis in the original story. And when the clock strikes midnight at the first party she goes to, she sees a ghost who has demanded that she find her killer before he kills again. And then I added a little more supernatural elements to it
How fun is
for
that?
the full length novel. So yeah.
That sounds super fun. I love it. I can't wait. So sign me up to be your beta reader or whatever. Anything I can do to get my hands on an early copy.
You can always endorse it for me. That would be great.
Sure. There you go. You've got my email. Shoot it over. I will definitely
Okay.
take a read.
I'll just be like, she liked it, so you should too. Hopefully you'll like it.
Right.
I added a cat into the story,
Oh,
so
well, it's an automatic win then.
it's
I mean, you
automatic
can't
win.
grow it
Which
as
is
long
one
as
of the things my editor was like, you added a cat. I love this.
And is the cat evil or is the cat good? Because cats
the
always get the evil rap.
the cat is good.
Oh,
He
I love
can
you.
see beyond the veil though. So
Oh.
that's kind of how he notices things. And so my
Hmm.
main character can see, she can see beyond too. And so
Hmm.
he'll be like looking, because I have to add a little bit more of that when I do my revisions, but he'll be like looking and he's like seeing like all these things
You
in the
know, people
corner.
talk about animals where they do that though. Like you're
Hmm.
sitting in, and all of a sudden the animal looks like that they're following somebody else in the room, and they're
Yeah.
and you're like, what are you looking at? You
I
know,
have two cats. It is a thing.
it
Like, and
is.
then last night, one of my cats, she just starts running, and I'm like, "Where are you going? Like,
Yeah.
what is it? Like, what has your tail so bushy?
Uh
Why
huh.
are you running? Like,
Uh
what
huh.
is in here?"
You know what else is creepy? Not to get off topic, and we'll close up here in a second. But the other thing that's creepy is babies do the same thing. It's so weird. My daughter, when she was little, I was holding her. She was probably like 6 months old, and she starts staring up at the corner of the ceiling and starts giggling like somebody's going coochie coochie coo, and she's having this giggle fest with this imaginary something, or not imaginary, who knows? And I looked
I
at her and I
know.
said, "Are you having a conversation with Jesus right now? And I can't see him, but you can. Like, what's going on?"
I know. I've heard some kids say some crazy things, and
Yeah.
like, My mom had a friend whose son, when he was around 4, he would tell her these stories, and they would be so like in depth, and it would be about like this woman who was like buried at this grave, and she's like, I've never taken him to this place, and then she went and like saw it, and it was like she's like it was very very strange, and
Whoa.
there was a lot like there was some like things that were attached to his like birth and stuff too that were
Hmm.
just that would make it so that it would make sense if he could see things that were like traumatizing for people, and she was like it was very scary. And so,
Oh, yeah, yeah. It is. It's always interesting when you dive into the world of fantasy or speculation, paranormal, supernatural, all of
mhm,
that. It just, it always makes your imagination go, whoa. And I get
mhm.
little sparks flying. So it's super fun.
But
So,
my dad would with that boy specifically, he would be like, well, maybe he's just being talking to the angels, and
yeah.
it would, and she's like, yeah, that would make sense too, because that would be him, like
Yep.
just
Yep.
talking to angels, hanging out, and they would tell
Right.
him stories.
When I was a kid, I wanted so badly to know the name of my guardian angel that I prayed that God would give me the name of my guardian angel. And I don't know that God ever gave me the name of my guardian angel, but for some reason I got hung up on the name Marcus. And so I was like, oh, Marcus is my guardian angel. And now I look back and I'm like, that was the weirdest thing to get stuck on. Like, what kid wants to know who their guardian angel is? But
That's funny. It's funny.
oh, fun. Well, Marat, this has been a blast. And thanks for having fun, candid conversations, which I always have a blast doing. If people want to find out more about you, they want to follow you, get to know about your books, etc., what's the best way for them to do that?
So I'm very active on my Instagram. That's kind of the social media that
Hmm.
I stick to. I do have a Facebook page that I don't post on it too much. I have my newsletter. I do it through Substack,
Hmm.
which I really like. It's kind of like I can do like a blog format and stuff. And so I'm getting used to it because I switched it over. So I have my newsletter, my Instagram, my Facebook. And then yeah, I think that's pretty good where you can find
Awesome.
me.
All right. Sounds good. Well, thank you so much for being with us today. And this has just been a blast. I appreciate
Yeah,
it.
it's been great.